King Henry VIII is one of history's most infamous kings. After a jousting accident in 1536, he began suffering from horrible leg ulcers, limping his way through a decade of terrible pain in a way that could give Kaiser Soze a run for his money. Let's just hope no one was drinking coffee near him. But could it be possible that a terrible leg injury was responsible for Hank's foul disposition? Well, today, let's examine everything you didn't know about Henry VIII's ulcerated leg. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. Then, leave a comment and let us know what other historical eras you would like to hear about. Okay, let's get hopping. Henry VIII is one of history's most notorious figures, which is why he keeps showing up in Weird History episodes. Hank was responsible for the execution of over 57,000 people during his reign, and his revolving door of wives was so infamous it fractured the Catholic Church and became a Broadway musical. He wasn't a great guy. But Henry wasn't always a problematic monarch. Highly regarded as a young king, Henry showed promise. But things changed when he became convinced his wife, Catherine of Aragon, wouldn't be able to give him a son. An issue that became known as the King's Great Matter, which is a euphemism Catherine must have loved. Shortly afterward, he fell for Anne Boleyn and declared his marriage with Catherine annulled through a series of attacks against Catholicism, with heavy hitters like Pope Clement VII, Martin Luther, and Cardinal Thomas Wolsey getting pulled into the crossfire, until the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, finally ruled in favor of the annulment. You pretty much get your way when you're the king, but sometimes you have to work for it. But then, 3 years later, a single event would change the course of their entire lives. In 1536, Henry participated in a jousting tournament. During a bout against Sir Henry Norris, the king missed his opponent and fell off his horse. The startled, fully armored horse then fell on top of the king, like a wrestling match at a state fair. Naturally, this knocked the monarch unconscious. Anne, who was pregnant at the time, saw the whole thing, and the shock of Henry's injury, and the worry that he would likely not make it out alive, may have triggered her miscarriage, which would eventually lead to her ultimate fate. If you watched The Tudors on Showtime, you know where this is going. Henry survived but suffered multiple fractures in his legs. Although he made it out alive, his entire personality changed, and those in the know began referring to 1536 as the King's Annus Horribilis, his horrible year. Needing medical care in the 16th century was like gambling, except instead of counting cards, you count scars. Medical knowledge wasn't exactly cutting edge, and antibiotics definitely were not a thing yet. But did they still give you those little lollipops for behaving yourself? The king had to rely on his doctors to patch him up after the horse joust leg accident. For their part, the royal doctors saved Henry's life. But as we mentioned, medicine during this period was imprecise. Though he seemed fine at first, the king developed excruciating ulcers all over his legs. The doctors tried everything, but could do nothing to treat the seeping wounds. Hope you weren't eating while watching this. Historians note that Henry's behavior and personality changes for the worse shortly after developing these lesions. And just 6 months after the accident, Henry ordered the elimination of Anne Boleyn, spurred in part by her miscarriage, and trumped up via a series of explosive charges of treason and incest that were likely fabricated. He had his main man, Thomas Cranmer, annul the marriage before Anne was taken out, which was thoughtful of him. Then, the day after Boleyn's execution, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour, marrying 10 days later. Seymour gave Henry a son, but perished during complications from birth. And Henry, dealing with all of this alongside his festering ulcers, started putting on a lot of weight. Royals have a reputation for overeating and excess. Henry VIII was no exception, but he was very active for much of his life. He loved sports and participated whenever he could. In his 20s, Henry was 210 pounds with a 32-inch waistline. That's not even big enough to be a defensive lineman. Guess he didn't love sports that much. But he could barely exercise after developing leg ulcers. And while he tried to keep up public appearances, In his private life, he knew it was bad. Henry wrote to Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, in a letter, "To be frank with you, which you must keep to yourself, a humor has fallen into our legs, and our physicians advise us not to go far in the heat of the day." So Henry indulged in eating, drinking, and terrorizing the kingdom instead. Part of Henry's plunge into the excess included writing what was called the Ordinances of Eltham, a stomach-bursting description of what the king expected to eat every day, which included around 20 gallons of beer and wine, all matters of edible birds from pheasant to quail, and the simply stated butter and eggs. He basically ate his way through an entire Cheesecake Factory menu every day. His behavior ravaged his body over the course of a decade. By 1546, Henry gained so much weight he had to be transported in wooden chairs, and he could no longer lift himself, requiring a hoist to be lifted onto his horse. That horse must have really hated his job. In the end, Henry's final suit of armor showed he weighed over 300 pounds and had a 52-inch waistline, so maybe a last-round pick for a low-seeded team. But the leg ulcers weren't the only contributing factor to his health problems. While the many fractures he sustained during the jousting accident were a primary cause of his leg ulcers, Henry's clothing choices didn't help matters. As a young, handsome king, he liked to show off, especially his calves, handsome Squidward style. He even participated in calf muscle bulging contests in the 1500s, which sounds like a deleted scene from Top Gun. Hank's calves were so amazing that Venetian ambassador Giustiniano Wina once described Henry in writing as the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on, above the usual height, with an extremely fine calf to his leg. Just imagine Giustiniano's diary. Naturally, Henry VIII couldn't resist highlighting his lovely legs, wearing tight garters around the top of each calf, even continuing the practice after his injury and decline in health. Today, we know that tight, constricting clothing can lead to blood clots, varicose veins, and thrombosis. But none of this was known at the time. It's entirely possible that Henry's clothing choices contributed to some of the leg problems he experienced later in life. Talk about suffering for fashion. Multiple leg fractures, a jousting accident, and tight garters are all likely causes of Henry's leg ulcers. But that didn't stop historians from seeking alternative explanations for Henry's severe ulcers. At some point, a theory emerged that the king had syphilis, based on his many maladies, both physical and mental, and his struggles to produce an heir. However, modern historians generally reject the theory. Although the king may have been a carrier of the disease, which could lead to him passing the disease to his wives who pass it on to their children, there is no record of him receiving mercury treatments or being out of the public eye for a long period. There's also no record of any of his wives being treated or showing symptoms, further discrediting the idea. Seeping leg wounds are chronic and painful, and tend to be on the low end of anyone's wish list. There's no doubt that Henry VIII suffered greatly every day, and his doctors took a unique approach to pain management, cauterizing the ulcers with burning hot irons. It wouldn't be medieval medicine if it weren't terrifying. Unfortunately, searing the pain away wasn't terribly effective, and the king's condition only worsened. If that weren't bad enough, there wasn't any anesthetic during these treatments, and the open wounds allowed infections to thrive. The condition got so bad that subjects could smell the odor from his ulcers 3 rooms away. Someone passed the royal clothespins. While historians have long since discussed Henry's leg ulcers, doing so during his reign was a bad idea and could have been a death sentence. The king wanted to be seen as powerful and strong, especially when his power was no longer checked by the Pope. Later in his life, Henry went a little crazy with beheading nobles, wives, and subjects alike. Among his list of victims were Henry Courtenay, 1st Marquis of Exeter, and Henry Pole, 1st Baron Montague, who were officially accused of treason. Henry had specifically created both positions for these two men, so you know he must have been seriously pissed to break up the three Hanks. Courtenay and Pole were officially charged with participating in what would become known as the Exeter Conspiracy, an alleged attempt to overthrow Henry VIII and replace him with Courtenay himself. Historians believe the would-be coup was inspired by Henry's admonishing of the Catholic Church and yoinking of the Church of England's power. But Henry made it, somehow, even more personal. During their trial, a witness testified that they disrespectfully discussed the king's health. The men were quoted as saying, "He has a sore leg that no poor man would be glad of, and that he should not live long for all his authority next God. He will die suddenly. His leg will kill him, and then we shall have jolly stirring." Henry was displeased, to say the least, so he beheaded both of them. And honestly, they should have seen that coming. It was kind of his signature move. Questioning the king was obviously perilous, and as Henry VIII's legs continued to deteriorate, he would go on to whack many more people through the end of his reign. As a French physician who tried to treat Henry put it,
"In this country, you will not meet with any great nobles whose relations have not had their heads cut off."
If festering wounds and major BO weren't bad enough, King Henry VIII likely suffered from diabetes and hypertension as well. His constant eating and drinking worried his doctors. After all, consuming roughly 5,000 calories a day isn't good for your health, unless you're The Rock, or you're training to defeat The Rock. The doctors asked the king to cut back, but he adamantly refused, so the royal court began whispering jokes about his habits, saying things like, "The king is very stout and marvelously excessive in eating and drinking, so that people worth credit say he is often of a different opinion in the morning than after dinner." In other words, Hank is grouchy until he's had his cheeseburgers. Today, we know Henry's extreme overeating leads to high risks for obesity, diabetes, and hypertension. These diseases are also known for making vascular disease, like Henry's leg ulcers, much worse. If the king suffered from any of these conditions while dealing with his leg ulcers, it could have worsened them. But did he? Historians and medical experts have different theories based on circumstantial evidence and retroactive observation, but no one knows for sure. Whatever the case may be, Henry's health problems grew progressively worse, ultimately leading to his demise from renal failure at age 55. Presumably, someone strummed a tender version of the Herman's Hermit song on a lute at his bedside. So what do you think? Was Henry VIII's infamous behavior the result of an infected leg? Or was he just a royal jerk? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.